Okay, so we can go ahead and move on to our one-way bearing for our main gear, as well as the motor mount and the front tail pulley. I'm going to go ahead and start off with the tail pulley because this has the most screws. You'll note that on the carbon ring, there's like a specific way that it needs to be oriented because otherwise the screw holes don't line up. So just make sure that you rotate it and ensure that all of the screw holes line up before you start to screw down these small little countersunk screws. Alright, so that's our completed tail pulley. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the main gear with a one-way bearing. So this actually slots through. You can see that there are cutouts in this main gear. So we're going to go ahead and place this in. It's going to be a very tight fit. So you kind of want to make sure that you get things lined up correctly before you push it all the way down. We're going to take 4 of these larger M4 screws using a 3mm driver. You can go ahead and put some Loctite on them and then work them in. In my case, my one-way is not perfectly aligned, but I'm going to go ahead and pull it into place using my screws evenly. And there we go, our main gear has our one-way bearing assembly installed into it. The next step is going to be to assemble our motor mount. So our pinion here is going to ride inside of these bearings, but these bearings are going to go into these bores here. So I'm going to go ahead and glue these bearings into place using some Loctite 638, and then we'll assemble the rest of it. Then we can go ahead and put our pinion in. You will want to make sure that you mount your motor into the motor mount because you cannot get direct access to the motor screws unless you use like a ball driver. And there is a completed motor mount. Okay, so the next step is going to be to put our main shaft through the frame with our main gear as well as our tail pulley. You'll note in the bag for bag 9 you have a small spacer. This is extremely important to make sure you get this in the right spot because otherwise your belt will not align correctly and things will make bad noises. It just will not work out very well for you. If you look at your main gear assembly with the one-way bearing hub, you've got the socket head cap screws that are on one side of it, and then you have the rest of the hub. The exposed side of the hub is actually going to face up, so your socket head caps are going to face down, and so this stack will actually basically be within the frame. That's with the helicopter facing upwards. Your spacer is going to go here between the bottom bearing in the frame, or the bottom bearing of the main bearing block, because there is a third bearing block with this helicopter, but I'll show it to you when I go to put it all together. That spacer will be there. Your main shaft will come through from the top, and you'll make sure that your tail pulley is actually going to have the open side down here where you're going to put your bolt through it facing downwards. And I'll show you that as I go to assemble everything. One thing to note is your main shaft is not going to be symmetrical. So it's going to have one side that goes down and one side that goes up. In this case, with my main shaft, the manual will tell you the measurements between the holes to the end of the shaft, but the one side over here that's actually got this chamfer in it is actually going to be the side that faces downwards, and it makes it easier to actually kind of drive everything through, as well as allow the shaft to get through the one-way bearing, because it's a sprag clutch, and if you can see, it's actually smaller diameter than the shaft itself, and that's just part of how they work. Now, in the manual, it does say to grease the one-way bearing, and I very highly recommend that, because if you don't do that, you'll get some pretty bad noises out of it, and you'll potentially see premature wear as well out of your one-way bearing. So now that I've got my one-way bearing all, I have a little bit of grease on the inside of it now, I can go ahead and start to assemble the helicopter. You take your main shaft, once again with the chamfered side, it'll face downwards. You can start to push it through the bearing. It's a very, very tight fit, which is good. So you're gonna want to push that through. It'll start protruding down here at the bottom, and as the upper frames are still loose, it's actually going to be easiest to kind of turn this over. So as you want to put things together, you put them, together in the right orientation. So you'll put your little spacer right. This is a very important spacer to make sure you get onto there. Your main gear with a one-way bearing housing is going to have that specific orientation. So once again, the exposed side of the one-way bearing hub is going to face upwards in the helicopter. Now it's upside down right now, so that's why you see the bolt heads, but you'll go ahead and put that there. I'll push the shaft through a little bit further. Now, one thing to call out here is when looking at your tail pulley, the front tail pulley, it is different. So one side is going to be round for where the bolt goes through, and the other side is going to be kind of a rectangle. The rectangle is there to actually help captivate the nylock that you're going to put through. So make sure you put your bolt through the correct side. And there we have it. Our main shaft is now installed with our main gear as well as our tail pulley. For the next step, we're going to go ahead and assemble our tail hub with the blade grips. Now, this is kind of an interesting process because I found that the tolerances are so tight for the thrust bearings. You really have to make sure that when assembling it, you align things correctly, otherwise they'll get stuck, and getting them stuck is really not a good thing. So as I go to actually assemble the blade grips, I'll kind of walk you through what I'm doing there. The actual hub assembly is quite simple to put together. You have your O-rings here. Now I do like to grease my O-rings for my tail, and 3 of them will go on each side, and then you'll use the blade grip spacer, this like cone brass washer, to actually help compress the O-ring stack into place. Now, if you look at these washers up close, you'll see that one side is like a definite cone, and then the other side has kind of a little bit of a lip to it, and the side with a little bit of a lip to it is the side that's going to face the O-rings. And if you actually place one of the O-rings up to it, you'll see that lip kind of is there to help keep the O-rings in O form. So when we go to assemble that, I'll show you kind of how that goes. While the manual does say that you want to put your tail hub together, I find that it's kind of easy. It's easy to do that. So I'm going to focus on the blade grips first. The other reason is because then I can use the feathering shaft to try to guide things in, and that's going to be super important for when we go through making sure that the thrust bearing is lined up and that our bearing over here is also lined up. To start off, I find that it's actually easier to go ahead and dry thread one side of the spindle for the tail together. And the reason is so that you can kind of use that to help pull the bearings through the tail grip as you are assembling it. And as I've shown when assembling the main head, you are going to have 2 different sizes of the silver, ends of your thrust bearing, right? So one side is going to be tight and the other side is going to be loose, and that's going to be based on the inner diameter of the thrust bearing piece. And so the tight side is actually going to be the one that faces outwards on the grip. So in my case, because I'm going to assemble the stack here, where I'm going to take my tail grip here, this tight one is going to go up against my dry fitted screw into my spindle, and then I'm going to take my cage here, for the thrust bearing, I'm going to go ahead and put it on there. The open side of this is going to face outwards, put that there, and then the loose inner side is going to fit into here as such. And I am going to grease this, so I'm going to go ahead and grab my grease, make sure I get a decent amount of grease onto there. It's important to note that there is excess grease that I'm gonna end up with here when I do something like this, but I do find that I get more effective, or I've had better results when I use a little bit more grease versus trying to be stingy with my grease. So as I do that, I can sort of spin the assemblies a little bit, or spin the ends together to try to distribute that grease as much as I can and squeeze that out. And there we go. Now I'll do a little bit of cleanup of this. Now we have a thrust bearing assembly that I am ready to try and pull through my blade grip. Now, one thing to note here, I have not glued my radial bearings in yet, and the reason is because if something goes wrong, I want to be able to try to knock out the thrust bearing pieces, while not having a bearing in the way, like a radial bearing like this in the way. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully try to guide this down, and you'll see it gets kind of tight right there. And as you pull it through, you'll find that the entire assembly, as long as you got it all aligned, will go in and will actually bottom out. And so you can kind of inspect that as well. Now I have my thrust bearing installed into my blade grip. And if you actually look on the bottom here, you can see that the blade grip, or the thrust bearing, is bottomed out into the blade grip. And you want to make sure that you can actually see that, because, and then that's also part of why I don't put my blade, my bearings in yet, because it's harder to kind of inspect this. But you don't want any gap between that, the inner lip here of the blade grip and the end of your thrust bearing. Otherwise, your assembly is not actually properly, is not done properly. Now, from here, you're actually going to find the small little spacer as well as one of the radial bearings, and you'll need to go ahead and put the radial bearing in. Now, I do like to use green Loctite. Keep in mind that when you do use green Loctite for this, you're going to need to use heat to get this entire assembly apart. If you have to, let's say you tail strike or something along those lines and you start having notchy bearings, that is something that you're going to have to do. But I do find that otherwise, my assemblies tend to last a little bit longer when I use green Loctite. So I'm going to go ahead and place my radial bearing on my spindle as well as the little spacer here, and you can see that spacer is there to actually make sure that the thrust bearing does not make contact with the outer race or the shield for the radial bearing. So it's super important to get that into place. Now I'm going to put my green Loctite onto my bearing, go ahead and start to feed this through, and just like the thrust bearing, you're going to need to make sure that you line this thing up correctly, because if it's not lined up correctly, it will not go in, and you will probably have problems. So that is one blade grip almost done. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that back out. We can see that if you inspect it on the inside here, there's no real gap. It should be like contiguous the entire way through to the end of that radial bearing, and you'll know that that is installed correctly. We can take the other radial bearing at this point and put it in on the back side, and I can go and do the same thing where I apply my green Loctite to it, and then you can go ahead and line it up, making sure that it is straight, and push that into place. Do a little bit of cleanup here, and that is one of the tail grips completed. So I'm going to go ahead and do it the same thing that I just did to the other one, and I'll be back. Alrighty. And so those are my assembled tail grips. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and put the balls in for the tail grips. These are, they're in the bag. I am actually going to use Loctite red for these, and they're going to go in from this side. So as you tighten them, you want to make sure that you have your orientation correct for them. All right, those are our assembled tail grips. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take my spindle here. You can clean out the threads of your spindle if you need to, because they, you're going to be putting Loctite on the screw or in the bolts as they go in. Now, for what I like to do, I like to actually put a little, I guess, a piece of like a shop towel or something, like, a paper towel into the thread of my spindle as I try to push the assembly through my O-rings, and the reason for that is because I like to lubricate my O-rings or grease my O-rings, so just trying to make sure that I'm not getting any grease into the threads there that might reduce the effectiveness of my Loctite. So there we go. Spindle has the O-rings inserted and lubricated. One thing that I'd like to do with the spindle shafts is actually I will apply Loctite to the threads of the screws here, and then I will go ahead and thread it in lightly. Pull it back out, and then we can see that the Loctite is actually distributed evenly on the inside of our shaft here. Now you can put a little bit more on the bolt. Now before you put this together, you got to make sure that you grab your blade grip spacer. Once again, we tried to go over the orientation, but the side with a little bit of the lip is actually going to be the side that faces inwards, and then the coned side is going to face outwards. So go ahead and slip that over my spindle. You can see that how it kind of will mate up there. We'll grab the blade grip. Now, if you look at the blade grips, one side is rounded and the other side has a spot for the nylock that you're going to use. So you want to make sure that your if your tail hub is facing this way with the shaft going away from us, your circular side is also facing you. And so I'm going to go ahead and slip that on. Start threading in our bolt. Okay. Now you're not going to be able to tighten that just yet because you're going to need to do the other blade grip as well. So we're going to go ahead. For speed purposes, I'm going to go ahead and just put that spacer on there now and grab our other socket head cap screw, put my Loctite on it, do the same thing where I'm going to thread that in first and pull it out. Okay. A little bit more. Take my blade grip. Make sure that they're oriented correctly. So the circular side of where the blade bolts will go are going to face towards us. Go ahead and thread this down. You're going to need two 2.5 millimeter drivers for this. I'm going to go ahead and prepare my other 2.5 millimeter driver. And tighten it down. You want to give it even amounts of torque. And that's not going to go anywhere. You'll note after you get this assembly done up, it is tight. I mean, it is like arguably, it's not cheap per se, but it's tight. Now, this will wear in. After you get a couple of your flights done, your tail will wear in, and it's the dampers within the tail hub here need to actually break in. That's going to loosen everything up. You'll note I did not even touch the spacers, and it's still very, very tight. So don't be alarmed if you get this thing together and it's tight like this. Every helicopter, every M7 I've built so far has been like this, but they all will loosen up after a few flights. And that's it. That's our tail hub. We can go ahead and move on now to the next step. Moving on to some of the tail control components. I went ahead and dug out the tail shaft out of bag 12. And the reason I do that, I'll show you, is because when you go to assemble your tail pitch slider, I find that I am a little bit more comfortable if there's the shaft on the inside here as I go to grip the tail shaft slider for assembly. Now, we're going to go ahead and start off, or at least I'm going to go ahead and start off with my tail pitch slider, just because that's the one that tends to be the most finicky in my experience. Now, you're going to have these larger stepped bearings, and you can go ahead and place one right there. You'll feed it through the guide ring. Now, you want to make sure that you grab your larger spacer. Go ahead and put that into there. And finally, put the bearing on from the other side, and you'll see that this entire assembly, you're not going to glue this, or I guess you could glue it, but it's I'm not going to glue it. It's been fine so far for what I'm doing, but now that that's onto there, we can see that this will actually go ahead and be screwed on with our yoke right here. Now, keep in mind that the yoke is reverse thread. So when you go to tighten this, you're going to need to make sure that you're turning it counterclockwise. One thing that I highly recommend is you should use thread lock on this. I use red Loctite. And the reason for that is because I have actually seen a few instances, not on the M7s, but just on helicopters in general, where these, the tail pitch sliders will actually back out and then cause a lot of problems, perhaps with tuning the tail, or worse, I've seen, loss of tail authority. So in my case, I tend to just kind of use red Loctite for that. Now, one thing that was also kind of recommended to me, red Loctite's very permanent, and once you kind of get this assembly, done up, you're probably not going to get it apart. So you kind of want to actually practice. So I like to use my Knipex pliers right here. I will go ahead and I'll grip that tail pitch slider in a manner that will allow me to go ahead and tighten things down. You want make sure that your shaft doesn't also fall through, right? Because time is kind of the essence as you go to tighten everything down. You can go ahead and spin the yoke back on like this, and just make sure that you can put an adequate amount of torque on this assembly. I'm not going to torque it now, but just in general, you want to be able to ensure that you can put an adequate amount of torque on there. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and grab my red Loctite, put a drop onto the threads there, and then tighten it down. And you will find that red Loctite, or if you have any experience with red Loctite, it tends to tighten, or it tends to start setting very quickly. So once you've done that, you can go ahead and make sure that the assembly is still smooth, and it is for me, and that it's still smooth, or is still on, slides on the shaft nicely. I found that sometimes if gripping the tail pitch slider, these flat spots, and you don't have the tail shaft in place, when you go to grip that to torque down this assembly, it can actually squeeze it a little bit, and then you'll find stiction on the tail shaft. So that's why I like to go ahead and dig out the tail shaft from the bag 12, and we won't touch that anymore for the assembly of the rest of the components, but that is what I generally do. So we can go ahead and move on to this assembly right here. Now, it's going to be kind of important that you make sure that the bearings go in from the right side, and they will just press in. I like to green Loctite my bearings, so I'm going to go ahead and apply green Loctite to them before I press them in, but you can do what you want. So now that I've gone ahead and glued my bearings into place, we can go ahead and finish up assembling attach the tail bell crank assembly here to my slider assembly. We're mating it together. Now, you'll need to use the M3x8, the half thread, the collared screws, and you'll be sticking them through the bearing, and then they'll thread into here. Now, because these screws are going through a bearing and we have access to the bottom side of or the threads, I actually like to go ahead and put the Loctite into the threads, and I find that this makes things a little bit cleaner, so that when if I ever have to go to disassemble this, I can make sure that I don't have any Loctite on the inside of my bearing. And you can see there is a little bit of Loctite there. I'm gonna add a little bit more. Just make sure that we have an adequate amount of Loctite. Spread it around with my little toothpick. Okay. Go ahead and wipe off that mating surface. Now, this is a symmetrical piece, so the orientation does not matter, but go ahead and move that in, click that into there. Now, you can grab your button head screws. Now, these are gonna use a 2mm driver. So now this assembly is completed and it is smooth running, which is great. We can go ahead and start moving on to the actual carbon arm here. Now, you'll have two options for where you're gonna place your ball joint, but the manual says that to use the outer hole. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. But you know, depending on your specific situation, if you're looking for a little bit of a different geometry for your tail, you actually can use the inner hole. And I just wanted to kind of, you know, clarify the orientation here. So your tail bell crank is gonna, or your tail assembly for the bell crank is gonna sit like this. Your carbon arm is actually going to stick over here. It's going to stick towards the front of the helicopter, because what will actually happen is if the tail boom is over here, this is the right side, this would be attached to the right side of the tail boom and the tail housing, and this carbon arm here is going to be sticking out and facing forwards. You can go ahead and grab the button head screws that you have. They use a 1.5mm driver for these, and I'm gonna add my Loctite. And go ahead and start threading this down. Alrighty, so I went ahead and tightened these two down, got Loctite on them, and then the last thing is going to be, at least for this specific assembly, to go ahead and put the ball joint in. And outer hole, go ahead and put your nylock on it. Start the threads there. And I like to use my Knipex pliers. These into the small ones. And there we have it. So that is the assembly. We have two more things to go ahead and get done on this page. So the first is, in the easier one, is actually going to be to go ahead and assemble our belt idler. So the belt idler here, if you look, you have this button head screw, and the button head screw actually sticks through there. It goes through this pulley. Now, you may see that the inner bushing of that pulley is going to be a little loose, but you can kind of finagle it into place. Then finally, you'll actually go ahead and just torque that down. So I'm going to put my blue Loctite on the threads and go ahead and start to tighten this down, trying to keep that blue Loctite out of the bearings for my pulley. And once that's there, we can actually go ahead and tighten it up just a little bit. Now, one thing to note is that this assembly actually, you know, needs to be somewhat parallel. So you can't really torque it down too hard yet, just because it's going to be easier to torque this once it's installed into the tail housing. But for now, you can go ahead and just kind of, you know, torque it down to the best of your ability while keeping it parallel. And that is your tail belt idler. Now, coming back to our tail pitch slider with our yoke, you'll note that the yoke has one side with threads and the other side is open. And your links over here actually have OMP on one side of them. So the side that has the threads is going to be the side on the opposite side of where the OMP faces. And so the easiest way to kind of like think about this is the socket head cap screw, the small one that you have that you use a 1.5mm driver with. You're going to want to make sure that that is going through and is on the same side as where the OMP logo is. Now, kind of like how I did the bearings over, or the screws for the bearings over here, I don't really want to get Loctite onto the inside of my bushing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and flip this over. I will put just a little bit of Loctite on the thread side. Use my toothpick to go ahead and spread that around, trying to make sure that I don't get any into the inner surface there. Grab my little bushing, put it through our link. These can be a little tight. And then go ahead, place our link with our bushing into place. Grab our screw and go ahead and tighten that down. Now, you don't really want to like muscle this down like crazy, because if you do, then you can run into stiction issues with your tail. Of course, this will loosen up over time, but you really want to make sure that your tail components are nice and smooth. So I highly recommend that you don't torque that down to the end of eternity. Just make sure you have an adequate amount of thread locker on there, and that should prevent things from loosening up. And I'll go ahead and do the same thing for the other side. Clean up our excess thread locker, and there we go. Moving on, we can go ahead and start looking at our tail case. You have your tail shaft, your tail case, 2 bearings, as well as your tail pulley, your belt, and now is the time to actually go ahead and grab your tail boom out. And you have 2 options for your tail boom. You can either go with a carbon fiber tail boom or the aluminum tail boom, the colored tail boom. In my case, I'm actually going to use the aluminum colored tail boom. My other M7's got a carbon fiber tail boom, and I think that looks super, super awesome. But in this case, I really like the blue, so I'm going to go ahead and use this tail boom. Now, one thing to note, you have a slot on the end, and if you remember when we went ahead and assembled our upper frames, there was that protrusion in the tail boom holder, and that protrusion needs to match up with this slot. So if the helicopter is facing to the right here, that protrusion is going to be on the left. The protrusion's on the left of the helicopter, and so you want to make sure that you get that orientation correct when you go to assemble your tail boom. Now, the other important thing as well is your tail case is not symmetrical. It actually has a notch here, and the notch here is to mate up with our tail pitch slider. So if you look here, that is a perfect little fit, and we will be attaching that in a further step. But for now, just make sure that you get this entirely oriented correctly. So the notch here is going to be on the right, or the notch within the tail case is going to be on the right, and the notch in the tail boom is going to be on the left. The manual has you put your bearings into the tail case at this point. I do like to use green Loctite, so I'm going to go ahead and use my Loctite 638. I've cleaned off my bearings with alcohol, and as well as the bores that they're going to go into. And then you, from the inside, go ahead and stick that in. And boom, there we go. Do the same thing for the other side. Stick it in. And as you can see, the bearings here have a semi-loose fit. So that's kind of why I like to make sure that I glue them in, because if I don't glue them in, I found that sometimes they can spin or lead into problems. So overall, I like to glue my bearings in and make sure that I have an adequate amount of of security behind that. So now that we've glued our bearings into the tail case, we can look at our tail shaft, and you'll actually note that the tail shaft, the holes on it, and the manual will tell you this, they're very, very close to being the same distance, but they're not. It's actually a 0.5 millimeter off. And so you'll need to make sure that you get this thing oriented the correct way. You can use a set of calipers to actually measure, and that's what I'm going to do, but you definitely want to make sure that you get this put in the correct way. Otherwise, your assembly will not go together properly. So the longer side is going to be the side that actually goes into the tail case. So you can go ahead and grab your belt now and feed it through. Now, my tail case is going to be facing this way, so go ahead and make sure that I've got the tail pulley going in from the correct side. You can, as you stick your tail belt in, you can actually pull it out through the top or the bottom. Go ahead and make sure that the hole in the tail pulley for where you're going to put the screw in is on the correct side, which is going to be on the left side, the side opposite of where the notch in the tail case is. Go ahead and pull that in, put it through between the bearings. And now you're going to take your tail shaft, and remember, we need to find the side that has more sticking out. So I'm going to go ahead and double check that. And so that's going to be this side for me. I'm going to go ahead and stick that through. Stick it through the tail pulley. You'll know you've chosen the right side, because when you align this tail pulley and you get your screw through it, it's actually going to be, your shaft will be flush with the bearing as it sticks out on this side. And go ahead and find the side of the tail pulley that has the counter bore into it. We can grab our custom screw. This is actually a special screw specifically for the tail pulley. Use that with our little 1.5 millimeter driver. Loctite, and stick that down through and tighten everything up. And now we have our tail case with our tail belt, and everything is pinned properly. You can now actually start working on threading the tail belt through your tail boom. Now, once again, just make sure that the notch here on the tail boom is on the left side and that your shaft is sticking out towards the right. You want to make sure that you get your orientation there correct. One thing that I like to do with threading a tail belt through a tail boom, you don't crimp it over here, but what you can actually do is over here where you can mate the belt together, grab yourself a small zip tie and go ahead and zip tie it down. Your goal is to make sure that this diameter here is less than the tail boom so that it'll slide easily, but you can go ahead and just lightly, don't yank on this, but like just lightly go ahead and put up your zip tie. I'm gonna go ahead and flush cut it. And now this will actually slide through the tail boom a lot easier than if you were to try to just shove it through. And like I said, you want to make sure you do not crimp, do not bend this tail belt in any way, because if you do that, you can lead yourself into having a tail boom failure or a tail belt failure. Now you can see as I'm kind of putting it through, grab the rest of my tail assembly. There we go. And now make sure that my tail boom is oriented correctly. Stick that back in, and voila. Now we have the tail belt sticking out, and it is actually up and down right now, which is nice as well, because when we go to install this into the helicopter, we'll be able to do that. The manual does say that you can put the stickers onto your tail boom right now. I'm going to hold off on that until the model is complete. I find that it's a little bit easier to get everything lined up proportionally once that's done. However, if you want to go ahead and dig the stickers out and do that now, you definitely can. It is now time that we will mate the tail assembly together. So in bag 13, you'll find a whole bunch of hardware. You'll also find these tail boom protectors, and these actually are there to prevent the tail boom from getting crushed. You will find the socketed cap screws that we're going to use with these as well, and a few of the other ancillary components. Now, you'll want to go ahead and gather the rest of the tail components. So that's the tail hub with the grips, our pitch slider, the tail bell crank, as well as our idler for the tail belt. We'll go ahead and place the idler in. So we can kind of feed that into here. You'll see how the holes will line up for this as the tail belt kind of gets pushed down onto the tail pulley, and you will use the smaller button head screws with the 1.5 millimeter driver. I'm going to put some Loctite on these. Now, if you remember earlier, I had mentioned that for the idler here, you actually you can torque this down, but it's a little bit easier if you wait until this point to torque it down. Now, it's been less than 10 minutes or so since I actually initially put Loctite on there, so I'm not too worried about Loctite, the Loctite not being seated and me going and actually pushing that in. But you'll want to make sure that you haven't waited too much time, because if you have, then you actually might be better off pulling this bolt out and then re-Loctiting everything. Now we can go ahead and thread in our we can attach our tail case to our tail boom. So I'm going to grab my 2.5 millimeter driver along with some Loctite and the washers. Now, I am not going to torque this just yet. I want to make sure I get all 4 of my socket head cap screws in before I go to torque this down, just so that, you know, we don't have any misalignments. All right, and there we have it. Our tail case is now mated up using our tail boom protectors to our tail boom. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab my tail pitch slider. We can go ahead and slide that onto here. It's still very, very smooth, which is nice. You can grab the tail rotor assembly. So this is like the hub and our blade grips, which we already assembled. I'm going to go ahead and move those out of the way just so that I can get better access. 2 things. You'll note on the tail hub there's a hexagonal cutout, and that's actually going to be to capture your nylock. So make sure that you're sticking or you're sending the bolt through from the right side or the correct side. Go ahead and grab yourself a 2mm driver, stick that through, and grab your nylock, torque that down, and there we go. Now, I am not going to go ahead and attach my tail pitch slider just yet. I'm gonna wait until after I get my bell crank attached. So now you can take your tail bell crank base. That's gonna go ahead and slot into place here. You can actually see that there's a nice little cutout. Make sure that you get this correctly oriented so that the round part of it is going to be sticking towards the rear of the helicopter. Grab yourself a 2mm driver, your socketed cap screws that work for this. Now, I am not going to tighten both. I'm going to wait until I get both into place before I tighten them, just to make sure that everything is aligned. And now we can see that we're almost finished. We can actually go ahead and use the silver screws. And you'll see that these are kind of special because they don't have any threads on the end of them, but they do have threads back here. And the reason is because the non-threaded side actually slides into the tail pitch slider assembly right here. Alrighty. Now that we have that into place, this is part of why I don't like to go ahead and assemble everything. I want to make sure that this entire assembly is as smooth as possible, because as soon as we attach it to our blade grips or our tail blade grips up here, it's going to get tight, and that's just because these haven't worn in yet. But once you do that, you can go ahead and actually snap these on. Now, it's important that the OMP faces outwards from the ball, so you don't want to be trying to snap them on backwards, because that is not how they're supposed to go on. I will grab myself my Knipex pliers. And there's one, and then the other one, kind of pushed out of the way a little bit. And that's it. So now we have a completed tail assembly, and you will feel that this is tight, but it will break in. In fact, I mean, you could, on the bench, you could actually just sit here and just keep working this back and forth, and you'll feel that it starts to get a little bit looser. So don't be alarmed if it's super, super tight, but it will break in. So the next step in the manual is actually to go ahead and install the tail boom into the upper frame. I am going to do my best to try to show this with the limited amount of camera angle I have, but basically you're going to need to make sure that your tail belt first off is straight, not twisted in the tail boom. And you can actually hold up the end of your tail boom to a bright light and look through and just kind of follow the belt. Once you've done that, you actually do need to twist it 90 degrees. So that's going to be counterclockwise 90 degrees if you're looking down the tail boom towards the rear of the helicopter. And once you do that, you can then kind of hold your tail boom, feed it through. Go ahead and start sliding it in. Making sure that that notch is on the left side, so it aligns. And then you want to guide this tail belt around the pulley. But of course, make sure that your tail boom is fully inserted. And then once you've done that, go ahead and route it back through. And now you can pull back on the tail boom, get it tight. And when you spin the main shaft, you can spin this looking down at the helicopter, you spin it clockwise. And when spinning it clockwise, the tail rotor should be spinning counterclockwise when looking at it like this. So you can see how that's spinning counterclockwise, and I'm spinning the main shaft looking down at the helicopter clockwise. And that's it. That's how you get your tail boom installed. All right. So for bag 15, I'm going to do this in kind of two different scenes, and that's just because we don't need the helicopter up here for when I set up my servos or attach the servo arms to them. But I do kind of want to show you the intricacy of installing the clamp here for the main shaft. Now, if you look at this clamp, it's got a lip on it, and that lip needs to face downwards towards the bearing here. So I'm going to go ahead and slide that over my shaft, make sure that that's aligned there. Now, you want to make sure you pull up on that main shaft, and there should be zero play up and down once this entire assembly is tightened. Grab yourself a 2.5 millimeter driver, put Loctite on the N3x14 that I went ahead and I retrieved out of my bag, and you can start to thread it through. Okay, so as you're tightening this collar, it's super important that you pull up on this main shaft and make sure that there's zero play. You want to be able to push down on this collar while also tightening the collar. And now there should be zero play up and down in this assembly, and that's super important because any slop there is just going to cause problems down the road. So I went ahead and centered my servos and set up attached the arms to them in the way that they're supposed to be oriented. These are, these are KST BLS 915 V8s, and I have a 905X V2 for the tail. But the same procedure will apply regardless of the servos that you're using. You just kind of make sure that the servos themselves are centered. If you can use a program box to actually center your servos, I find that that's a little bit easier from the fiberless setup, but it's not going to be exact. It's still going to require potentially some tweaking. So the plastic servo arms, you want to use the balls that are included in the bag for bag 15. These are going to be a little bit longer than the ones that are supposed to be used for the metal servo arms. However, in certain cases, if you decide to use the metal servo arms, you can actually still use these as long as the nylock, when attached to the rear of them, will still clear your servo body. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention is that the tail servo arm and ball are included with bag for bag 15. So you can actually go ahead, if you have your tail servo and set it up, you want to center it so that the arm is going to be sticking over the body of the tail servo like this. So your kit will actually include two different sizes of servo nuts as well as spacers. Depending on the servos that you're using, you're going to want to make sure that you choose the correct ones. You can kind of, dry fit them if you look and see how they fit. You want to make sure that you don't, they can actually set through. At this point, we actually can go ahead and just put our tail servo off to the side because we're not going to be setting that up, and we can go ahead and start to install our cyclic servos. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the rearmost servo. On most flight controllers, this will be channel number 1. You'll actually need to stick it through the frame from the inside here, and so you can see I can stick the wire for that servo there. I can push these zip ties out of the way that I already had put in place, and make sure that you have the servo that's got the arm sticking out on the bottom of the, if you were to hold the servo this way, you want the arm facing towards the right, and go ahead and finagle this in. Okay, so now I have my rear cyclic servo in my helicopter. I need to use the nuts here. These are the ones that have the threads on them for alignment. So you can actually go ahead and place the nut in like that, and using the shorter of the screws here, you can go ahead and actually put some thread locker on them. Use your 2mm driver, I'll put some thread locker on them, and start driving them in. There we have it. Our elevator servo, our channel number 1 servo for most flight controllers, has now been installed. One thing you want to one thing to note is that on newer versions of the kit, there is actually a modification that has happened to the left side lower servo brace, and what's actually happened is the servo it extends further back now, and it adds rigidity back here for the frame, but you'll be using longer screws and putting them through the additional block instead of just going directly through the frame here. That's the only difference. As long as you keep this member here on the frame, you won't feel anything different. But if you do have the newer version of the kit, you actually could theoretically omit this and just use a nut and a bolt for that. So the next servo I'm going to go ahead and install is the channel 2 servo. Now this servo is actually going to be facing the direction as such. Now you'll note that it's tight. If you have a servo where, like these KSTs, where the wires are sticking out of the back, you'll find that there's actually a cutout here, both in the frame as well as, it's designed to, the frame is designed to actually let you kind of run your wires in. However, to squeeze this in, it is tight. So you'll have to do a little bit of finagling, but once you get that into there, you'll use your servo alignment plates, and then you'll use the longer bolts to go ahead and tighten down the servo. Okay, so once you've sort of fished that through there, you can kind of leave this wire the way it is, and then go ahead and just put your servo alignment plates through and use some Loctite on your screws, and make sure that you torque everything down evenly. Alright, and that is our channel 2 cyclic servo installed. We can move on to channel 3. It's the same as it is for channel 2, so you'll need to also finagle your wires in through the back and make sure everything lines up. Now, in my case, because I still haven't run my ESC wires, I am actually not going to Loctite the servo into place because I still need to remove this plate. However, if you've already run your ESC wires, or you're going to have a different way to run your ESC wires from the front here, you can go ahead and just Loctite everything down. And there we have it. My channel 3 servo is now loosely put into place, and I can grab my last 2 servo alignment plates and use my bolts and tighten things down. All right, and those are the cyclic servos installed now. Okay, so now we can move on to our auxiliary plates. These are mounted within the lower, actually this one's mounted within the lower frame, and this is actually going to be mounted on the upper, but they're really nice because They allow you to mount things like a backup guard, or you know, if you're going to tie down, if you want to try to strap down your bullets for your motor, that's what you can do with this, or even put your capacitor pack up here as well. As I go to actually install them into the airframe, you'll sort of see where they go, and it'll hopefully make a little bit more sense. But for now, I'll go ahead and just use the countersunk screws with a 1.5 millimeter driver and some Loctite, and go ahead and set these up. There we go for our upper auxiliary plate. I've gone ahead and added the 4 countersunk screws through the narrower or shorter of the cross braces. Now to move on to the lower auxiliary plate. And there we have it. Our auxiliary plates have our cross braces attached to them, and we can put them off to the side for now. So the next step is going to be to assemble our battery tray release, or our latches. These are what retain your battery tray into the lower frames. There's 2 of them, and they actually are going to be symmetrical, so you assemble them in the same way. What you basically are going to do is you're going to take the housing for it, you're going to go ahead and put the spring in to it. You're then going to take your pin, and your pin is going to stick through like that, like so, where the smooth side of the pin is sticking out towards the flat face here. You then grab your knob, and your knob needs to go and have this and stick out. So when this is sticking out right here, you're able to then use this spacer / washer and your bolt, and actually you'll want to use a little bit of Loctite and make sure that you Loctite this assembly together. Once you get your button head and your spacer mounted through, you'll notice that it's kind of hard to actually get any torque on this screw, on the screw head with the assembly, because it'll just spin. So what I actually like to do is use a pair of Knipex pliers, which are parallel pliers, and actually grab the shaft here as I go to tighten it. And you want to make sure that you get enough purchase on it, but you don't also want to squeeze it so much that you deform it, because then it won't function as it's supposed to. So now that that's all torqued together, you can go ahead and test the mechanism. You can actually see that if you pull out the it has a little bit of a retainer here. You will note that it's like very, very loose when not mounted into the frame, and the reason is because the lower frame is actually going to guide this pin here. So it'll work a lot better once it's actually mounted into the frame, but you want to go ahead and make sure that you actually can pull out on it, and that the spring does its job of letting it stick or snap back in. Once I'm going to go ahead and assemble the other one here, and we'll be back. All right, here we go. Both of the battery tray latches are done. One thing to note is that the battery latch is going to be a little bit, the face here is recessed into this housing. If it's flush, you probably need to mess with it a little bit, because it's probably not sticking through the knob, or the shaft is not sticking through the knob properly. So just make sure that that happens, and then also you want to, like I said, make sure that these snap back in when you pull on them.